many Orientals put it in the food, into the brain, you can kill brain cells. So this, even though this concept is probable, but there are not too many active drug discovery programs that are simply aiming to enhance the glutamatergic activity. And then also there is the serotonin receptor hypothesis based on the fact that serotonergic neurons, the distribution of them are very closely related to the same region of the dopaminergic neurons. Actually, serotonergic neurons also seems to be more broadly spaced, so they actually innervate more areas. But many of them are actually co-localized with the dopaminergic neurons. And then blood serotonin levels is higher in schizophrenic patients with the abnormal brain scan. With that, as well as other evidence that the serotonin receptors also proposed too much serotonin may contribute to schizophrenia. Okay? So dopamine, serotonin. So this is simply show you that the yellow is dopamine, so this is the distribution of dopamine, and then the red is the serotoninergic distribution. And this is Raphe nucleus. Raphe simply means red, so if freshly cut brain is slightly reddish. So you can see that they overlap a lot. And then this is the functions of dopaminergic pathways. So you can see that some of them, so is memory, emotion, and some of the pressures, feeling. So they all can contribute to motivation, depression, all those, right? So it is involved. And then serotonin also is involved in mood, memory, processing, sleep, cognition, as well as is not put in here is appetite, control of appetite. So a lot of weight gain is related to serotonin also. So you can see that. So knowing these two systems, you get a sense of potentially what type of adverse effects or therapeutic effects that you can get. The antipsychotic drugs, this is actually antipsychotic drugs, many of them are on the top 300 list. This exact rank is about 2 years old, so I was too lazy to look at the last year's. But you can see that many of them are actually in the top, well, 3 of them are on the top 100, at least 3 years ago. Quetiapine, aripiprazole, etc., right? The reason that I know that aripiprazole is on the top 100 is because Abilify is being pushed very hard for depression, antidepressant. It's not necessary for anti-schizophrenic. So many of them are also used for other purpose too. So on this slide, so you know that it is important drug class, but on this slide I also want to point out that classification. Dr. Jen already mentioned that there are first generation, second generation antipsychotics, and Dr. Emmett also talked about them. But Dr. Emmett typically used the typical antipsychotic to represent first generation and use atypical antipsychotic to represent the second generation. But they are identical. First generation means typical. First generation means typical or conventional antipsychotic. Second generation means atypical antipsychotic is identical meaning, okay? So your textbook use FGA and SGA. So for the rest of this class, I will talk about first generation, second generation. So you can see that there are a lot of compounds. If you read your DiPiro textbook, you will realize that the chapter on the antipsychotic drugs is arranged very different from other book chapters. In this chapter, in other chapters, they would have paragraphs to talk about specific drugs, right? So if there's a haloperidol, there would be a paragraph or 2 or 3 to talk about the drug or the pharmacology and blah, blah, blah. But in this chapter of antipsychotics, there was absolutely no discussion of individual drugs. Okay? So you don't find a paragraph to talk about chlorpromazine or haloperidol. And if you look at, I look at 5, 6 different textbooks. They all look the same. nobody will talk about the individual drugs, okay? In Dipiro, you simply have tables to compare different drugs, their onset, the doses of all these 20-some drugs, side effects, etc. So nobody wants to talk about the individual drugs. So when I first, several years ago, prepared this class, I spent a whole summer to look for the individual drug information, the clinical trials, the animal studies. And then I tried to summarize them to have some guidelines. I realized it's very difficult to summarize them. You just learned in the last lecture, right? There are so many exceptions. You just learned some rules, but there are 2 or 3 drugs that have exceptions, almost no rules. So if I do it the single drugs at a time to explain all of them, it would require about 3 hours. And then afterward, you don't remember a thing anyways. So I'm not going to talk about all of these drugs. I'm only going to talk about 2 on the first generation, and then about 4 on the second generation. And then, but before then, I'll just give you some general guidelines, and so that, because even though if I force you to memorize all these details, after the test, you probably would forget them. And a lot of the detailed information you probably need to learn in the clinic when you're working in there. Okay, so what are the general guidelines? Dr. Emmett already mentioned it very nicely. The first generation, their affinity, this drug's affinity to the D2 receptor is typically better, stronger than the 5-HT2A receptor. Second generation is either the same or the 5-HT2A has a high, the drug would have a higher affinity to 5-HT2A than D2, right? Now, so memorize that. That sticks in your mind. First generation is D2 better than 5-HT2A. Second generation is typically either equal or 5-HT2A better than D2. And now by saying that, I do not mean that these drugs do not interact with other receptors. As Dr. Emmett already mentioned, many of these drugs also block the muscarinic receptor, the histamine receptor, and some of them, even the alpha-1, alpha-2 adrenergic receptors. So you cannot just say that, oh, all the 1A, we only need to know about the D2 receptor. There's also other things too, okay?